A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. So I was looking at this flight tracker data the other day, and there's this Il-76 transport aircraft that left Damascus on March 24th, 2026, and just went straight to Moscow. No stops, no detours, no pretense. And that, apparently, is how you exit a 40-year family dynasty.
That's the one. And what's wild is that the tail number on that aircraft, when people dug into it, traced back to a Russian military transport squadron that's been running rotations between Hmeimim Air Base and Moscow for years. This wasn't some improvised evacuation. This was a scheduled extraction. It's like looking at a commercial flight schedule, but for geopolitical collapse.
Today's prompt from Daniel is about exactly this. What happens to the rest of the Assad regime, now that Assad himself has reportedly fled to Moscow, and why Russia is so invested in keeping him comfortable? And I think the more interesting question isn't really about Assad the person, it's about what he represents institutionally.
That's the right framing. And by the way, today's episode is powered by Xiaomi Mimo V2 Pro, which is generating our script as we speak. So if anything sounds unusually coherent, you know who to thank.
And if anything sounds unhinged, that's just us.
That's right, that's just us. So let's start with this distinction that I think most coverage glosses over, which is the difference between Bashar al-Assad as a human being, the former ophthalmologist who inherited a presidency, and the regime as a bureaucratic military apparatus. Because when we say the regime collapsed, what actually happened is more like the regime relocated.
Relocated. I like that word choice. It's less dramatic than collapsed, but way more unsettling when you think about it. It implies a kind of corporate merger or acquisition, where the brand gets absorbed into a larger conglomerate.
It should be unsettling. The Assad regime wasn't just one guy making decisions in a palace. It was a network of military intelligence directorates, paramilitary units, financial institutions, and patronage systems that had been building since Hafez al-Assad took power in 1970. When Bashar fled, the question isn't where did the president go? It's what happened to the four branches of military intelligence: the Republican Guard, the 4th Armored Division, the Air Force Intelligence Directorate, the Political Security Directorate.
You're listing those off like you've been memorizing an org chart.
I might have an org chart open right now. Don't judge me.
I'm judging you a little.
The point is that these institutions had their own command structures, their own revenue streams, their own relationships with Russian and Iranian counterparts. Bashar was the figurehead, the legitimizing symbol, but the operational capacity of the regime was distributed across dozens of senior military and intelligence figures. Think of it like a corporation. The CEO is the public face, but the real power lies with the division heads who control the factories, the sales channels, and the R&D labs.
So when he gets on that Il-76, he's not bringing the whole regime with him. He's bringing, what? The brand?
The brand is actually a good way to put it. He's bringing the nominal authority, the international recognition, the face on the currency. But the actual machinery of repression and control, the people who ran checkpoints, who managed detention facilities, who controlled smuggling routes, those networks don't evaporate just because the president left. Some go to ground, some cut deals, and some, as we're seeing, get a ticket out.
Okay, so here's what I want to dig into. Russia. Why Moscow? I mean, there were other options theoretically. Iran has been Assad's other major patron. Why does he end up in Russia specifically and not Tehran?
Several reasons, and they're all strategic. First, Russia has the infrastructure for this. This isn't their first rodeo with hosting deposed leaders. Viktor Yanukovych, the former Ukrainian president, fled to Russia in 2014 after the Euromaidan revolution. He's been sitting in a Moscow suburb for over a decade now. Before that, there was a whole ecosystem of former Soviet Republic leaders who ended up back in Moscow when their regimes fell. It's a well-worn path.
It's like a retirement community for dictators.
That's actually not far off, but there's a serious strategic logic to it. When Russia hosts a deposed leader, it maintains a claim on that country's political future. As long as Assad is in Moscow, Russia can argue that it's protecting the legitimate government of Syria. That's a legal and diplomatic card they can play in international forums.
Does anyone actually buy that argument, though? I mean, the UN seat has already been contested.
You'd be surprised. International law is messy on this. If a government in exile maintains diplomatic recognition from even a handful of countries, it creates complications for the new authorities trying to access frozen assets, renegotiate treaties, or gain UN seats. Russia doesn't need the whole world to accept Assad as legitimate. It just needs enough ambiguity to maintain leverage. It's a legal fog machine.
So it's not about actually restoring Assad to power. It's about keeping the option on the table as a bargaining chip.
Exactly. Wait, I'm not supposed to say that. Let me rephrase. The bargaining chip interpretation is the strongest one. Russia knows Assad isn't going back to Damascus. But having him in Moscow means that any future settlement in Syria has to account for Russian interests, because Russia holds the symbolic head of the former government.
You almost said exactly there. I saw it in your eyes.
I caught myself. It was close.
Very disciplined. Okay, so let's talk about the actual mechanics of how Russia set this up, because I refuse to believe this was a snap decision made in the final days of the regime. This had to be planned well in advance.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where it gets really interesting from an intelligence and logistics perspective. Russia started building evacuation contingencies for Syrian leadership back in 2015, right after their military intervention began. The FSB, that's Russia's Federal Security Service, the successor to the KGB, has a specific unit called Department 8 that handles liaison with foreign security services. They've maintained direct communication channels with Syrian Mukhabarat, which is the overarching term for Syrian military intelligence, since the intervention started.
So there were dedicated Russian intelligence officers, whose job was essentially to maintain a hotline to Syrian intelligence in case everything went sideways.
That's a fair characterization, and it wasn't just communication. The Russians pre-positioned assets. Tartus, the Russian naval facility on Syria's Mediterranean coast, has been operational since 1971. It was expanded significantly under a 2017 agreement that gave Russia a 49-year lease. That facility wasn't just for naval logistics. It served as a staging ground for non-combatant evacuation operations. They built a dedicated, secure dock area for exactly this kind of scenario.
So Tartus is functioning as both a military base and essentially an escape route.
Think of it as a forward operating base with an integrated extraction capability. And Hmeimim Air Base, which Russia established in 2015 near Latakia, provided the air bridge. Transport aircraft could move people and sensitive materials from Damascus to Hmeimim, and then from Hmeimim to Russia. The Il-76 that reportedly carried al-Assad was part of that air bridge infrastructure. It's a two-stage rocket. Get the asset to the secure zone, then launch them to the home country.
This is starting to sound less like a political asylum situation and more like a military extraction operation.
Because it was both. And here's the thing most people don't realize. The evacuation wasn't limited to the Assad family. Multiple reports indicate that senior Syrian military intelligence officers, their families, and in some cases sensitive documentation were moved through Russian channels in the weeks and months before the final collapse. The Russians weren't just saving a president, they were extracting an entire command network. We're talking about plane loads of people and boxes, not just one family with suitcases.
Wait, so when you say sensitive documentation, what are we talking about here? Intelligence files?
Intelligence files, financial records, communications intercepts, the kind of material that could be enormously valuable to whoever takes over Syria. If the new authorities got access to the full archive of Syrian military intelligence, they'd have a roadmap of every covert operation, every informant network, every financial transaction the regime conducted for decades. Imagine getting the complete source code for a surveillance state.
That's leverage for days.
It's leverage, it's intelligence, and it's also protection. If Russia holds those files, it has compromising information not just about the Syrian regime, but potentially about Iranian operations, Hezbollah networks, and various other actors who collaborated with Assad. That's a treasure trove for Russian intelligence services. It's a library of secrets, and Russia just became the head librarian.
Okay, I want to pivot to the financial side because I think this is where a lot of people's assumptions break down. When we hear the regime collapsed, there's this image of everything just dissolving. But regimes like this don't keep all their money in one country.
Right, and this is a critical point. The Assad regime had been moving financial assets to Russian institutions for years before the collapse. Syrian central bank reserves, regime-connected business holdings, individual accounts belonging to senior figures, a significant portion of this was pre-positioned in Russian banks. Some estimates suggest billions of dollars in Syrian state and regime-connected assets were held in Russian financial institutions by the time Assad fled. This wasn't a rainy day fund, it was a strategic relocation of the treasury.
Billions. So when he lands in Moscow, he's not arriving destitute. He's arriving with access to a financial network that's already been established.
And this is the part that connects to Russia's broader strategic calculus. Russia isn't just hosting Assad out of friendship or ideological alignment. The financial relationship is transactional. Russia gains access to capital flows, investment opportunities, and economic leverage in the Middle East. Hosting Assad is partly about maintaining control over those financial channels. It's a custody arrangement with a management fee.
It's like a custody arrangement, but for a dictator's offshore accounts.
That's one way to put it. And it also raises questions about the future. If Syria's new government demands the return of state assets that are sitting in Russian banks, Russia can point to Assad, the nominal head of the former government, and say, "We're holding these on behalf of the legitimate authorities." It's a legal shield for keeping the money. The new government has the country, but Russia has the checkbook.
That's infuriating if you're the new Syrian government. You've won the war, you've taken Damascus, and the former regime's treasury is sitting in Moscow with the former president sipping tea next to it.
Which brings us to the practical implications for Syria's reconstruction. The new authorities face an enormous challenge. They need to rebuild institutions, restore services, manage security. And part of the regime didn't actually surrender. It just moved to another country and retained its financial resources and intelligence networks. They're trying to build a new house while the old owner is sitting on a pile of the bricks in a foreign country.
So the regime didn't collapse. What's the right word? Exfiltrated?
Exfiltrated is actually pretty accurate. And this is where I think the Moscow exile ecosystem becomes such an important concept. Russia has been systematically building infrastructure for hosting deposed authoritarian leaders. Yanukovych from Ukraine. Various former Afghan officials after the Taliban victory. Now Assad. Each one of these exiles serves a strategic purpose. It's a collection, and each piece has a use.
What's the purpose with the Afghan precedent? Because that one seems different.
It is different in some ways, but the logic is similar. When the Taliban took Kabul in 2021, former President Ashraf Ghani fled to the UAE, but Russia maintained relationships with various former Afghan military and intelligence figures. Some ended up in Moscow. The value there was access to networks that understood the security landscape in Central Asia, which is Russia's soft underbelly. They were recruiting analysts for their own backyard.
Russia's collecting intelligence assets like Pokemon.
I'm not going to dignify that comparison with a response.
You just did.
Moving on. The broader pattern is what I'd call the revanchist corridor. Moscow is positioning itself as the hub for anti-Western leaders in exile, creating a parallel diplomatic network. These exiles maintain contacts in their home countries. They have institutional knowledge, and they provide Russia with ongoing access to political and intelligence networks that would otherwise be lost when a regime falls. It's a shadow cabinet for a dozen different countries, all operating from the same district in Moscow.
So Assad in Moscow isn't just one guy in a dasha. He's a node in a network.
A very valuable node. Consider what Assad still has access to. He knows the personal details, the private communications, the secret agreements of every senior figure in the Syrian regime for the past 20+ years. He understands the relationship between Syrian military intelligence and Iran's Quds force. He knows where the bodies are buried, both literally and figuratively. That institutional memory is priceless.
That's dark but probably accurate.
And here's what I find really fascinating from a geopolitical analysis perspective. Russia's relationship with Assad has always been more transactional than ideological. Russia didn't support Assad because they loved his governance model. They supported him because he gave them Mediterranean naval access through Tartus, a foothold in the Middle East, and a client state that was dependent on Russian military support. It was a real estate deal, and a strategic partnership rolled into one.
So the friendship is strategic, not personal.
Almost entirely strategic. And that's important because it means Russia's calculus about what to do with Assad and Moscow is also strategic. If at some point Russia decides that Assad is more valuable as a bargaining chip to trade with Syria's new government, say in exchange for guarantees about Tartus or Russian economic interests, they wouldn't hesitate to make that trade. He's an asset on a balance sheet, not a guest in their home.
That's cold.
That's realpolitik, and there's precedent for it. Russia has historically been willing to sacrifice individual allies when the strategic math changes. The question is whether the math has changed yet, or whether Assad still provides more value in Moscow than he would as a concession. They're running the numbers constantly.
Let me ask you something that I think listeners might be wondering. There's this report from Euronews about Assad living in supervised exile in Moscow with banned public appearances and limited movements. So he's not exactly free there either, right?
No, and that's a crucial detail. Multiple sources indicate that Russia has imposed strict restrictions on Assad since his arrival. He can't make public statements. He can't engage in political activity. His movements are monitored. Russia doesn't want him becoming a rallying point for regime loyalists who might try to mount some kind of counter-revolution. He's useful to Russia as a controlled asset, not as an independent political figure. He's a symbol in a display case, not a player on the field.
So he traded one gilded cage for another.
With better heating, presumably. Moscow winters are no joke.
I hear the dachas are well insulated, though. Okay, let's talk about what this means for the rest of the regime's figures. Because we've been focusing on Assad, but there were thousands of people who were part of this apparatus. What happens to the mid-level intelligence officers, the military commanders, the bureaucrats?
This is where it gets really complicated, and honestly where the situation is still evolving. Some have fled to Russia or other countries. Some have melted into the population. Some have been detained by the new authorities. But the ones who made it to Russia or who maintained contact with Russian intelligence represent an ongoing challenge for Syrian reconstruction. They're the loose threads that could unravel the new tapestry.
Why specifically?
Because they can be reactivated. If Russia maintains relationships with former Syrian military intelligence officers, those officers can be directed to gather information, disrupt the new government's operations, or maintain smuggling networks that benefit Russian interests. The regime's human infrastructure didn't disappear. Part of it went underground, and part of it went to Moscow. You don't need the whole army, you just need the colonels who know how things really work.
That sounds like a recipe for a long-term insurgency. Or at least persistent instability.
It's happened before. After the fall of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, former regime intelligence officers formed the backbone of the insurgency. They had the training, the networks, and the institutional knowledge to organize effective resistance. The question is whether Russia would actively support something similar in Syria, or whether they prefer a more cooperative relationship with the new government. It's the difference between arson and landlordship.
I think the answer probably depends on whether the new government is willing to honor Russian strategic interests, particularly around Tartus and economic agreements.
That's the most likely variable. If the new Syrian government says, look, we'll keep the Russian naval facility, we'll maintain economic ties, just work with us instead of against us, then Russia has less incentive to destabilize things. But if the new government moves to expel Russian military assets or align more closely with Western powers, then those exiled regime figures become a lot more useful to Moscow. It's a thermostat for instability.
It's like Russia has a toolkit full of different tools, and it'll pick the right one based on how the situation develops.
That's a reasonable way to think about it, and the toolkit is extensive. Financial assets, intelligence networks, military relationships, diplomatic leverage through the exiled government concept? Russia has multiple ways to influence Syria's future even without a physical military presence beyond Tartus and Hmeimim. They're not a one-trick pony.
Let me bring up something that I think is underappreciated in the coverage. The Chatham House analysis pointed out that the fall of Assad damaged Russia's reputation as a reliable ally. But I wonder if that reputation damage is actually as significant as people think, because Russia's already pivoted to a different model.
That's a sharp observation. The traditional model of alliance was, we support your government, and in exchange you stay in power and do what we want. The new model might be, even if you fall, we'll take care of you and maintain your networks, so the cost of betraying Russia is lower than the cost of staying loyal. It's a different kind of guarantee. It's an insurance policy against total loss.
Instead of, we'll keep you in power, it's, we'll keep you comfortable and useful after you fall.
And that might actually be more reassuring to Russia's remaining allies. Think about it from the perspective of, say, a Central Asian dictator watching what happened to Assad. The old message was, Russia couldn't protect its ally. The new message is, even when things went wrong, Russia extracted the key figures and preserved their assets and networks. The narrative shifted from failure to managed transition.
That's a fascinating reframing. So the apparent failure, losing Assad in Damascus, might actually reinforce Russia's value proposition to other clients.
It depends on how you tell the story. And Russia is very good at telling stories. They'll frame it as a strategic redeployment, not a rout.
Okay, let's zoom out for a second. What should people who are following this actually be paying attention to? What are the signals that would tell us which direction this is going?
I'd watch three things. First, the financial flows. If Russian banks start releasing Syrian state assets to the new government, that's a signal that Russia is pivoting to cooperation. If the assets stay frozen, Russia is maintaining its leverage through the exile model.
Follow the money.
Always follow the money. Second, watch the movement of specific Syrian military intelligence officers. If former officers start appearing in Damascus and reconciling with the new government, that suggests Russia is facilitating a transition. If they stay in Moscow or disappear from public view, Russia is holding them in reserve. Their travel itineraries are a geopolitical map.
Joys. And
Third, watch the Tartus negotiations. The naval facility is the crown jewel of Russia's Syrian engagement. Everything else, the exile arrangement, the financial leverage, the intelligence networks, serves the ultimate goal of maintaining that Mediterranean access. If the new Syrian government negotiates a revised agreement for Tartus, you'll see Russia's posture shift accordingly. That's the linchpin.
So Tartus is the key to the whole thing.
Tartus has been the key since 1971. Everything else is a means to that end.
It's always about the warm water port with Russia. Every century, same story.
There's a reason for that. Russia has always been frustrated by its limited access to warm water naval facilities. Tartus gives them a presence in the Mediterranean that they can't get from their Black Sea fleet alone, especially with Turkish control of the Bosporus. Losing Tartus would be a significant strategic setback. It's their only true warm water Mediterranean port. Everything else is seasonal or constrained.
Which is why they'll do whatever it takes to maintain it, including playing the long game with Assad in Moscow.
Including playing the long game. And the long game might involve eventually trading Assad for guarantees. Or it might involve keeping him indefinitely as a symbol. Russia's good at maintaining ambiguity when it serves their interests. They're masters of the maybe.
One more thing I want to touch on before we wrap this up. There's this broader pattern that I think connects to something we've seen in other contexts. Russia is essentially building an alternative international order, not through formal alliances, but through a web of dependencies, exiles, financial entanglements, and intelligence relationships. The Moscow exile ecosystem is just one piece of that.
It's a piece that doesn't get enough attention because it's not as dramatic as military operations or diplomatic summits. But the accumulation of exiled leaders, frozen assets, and dormant networks gives Russia a form of influence that operates below the threshold of traditional geopolitics. It's influence through infrastructure rather than through force. It's the plumbing, not the fireworks.
Infrastructure of control. That's a phrase that's going to stick with me.
And it's worth noting that this isn't entirely new. The Soviet Union maintained networks of exiled communist leaders and dissident movements around the world. What's different now is the scale and the financial dimension. The amounts of money involved in modern exile arrangements dwarf anything from the Cold War era. The game is the same, but the chips are much, much bigger.
because globalization made it possible to move billions across borders in ways that weren't feasible before.
Right, in the Soviet era, you might provide a deposed leader with a dacha and a stipend. Now you're talking about pre-positioned central bank reserves, shell companies, cryptocurrency holdings, real estate portfolios. The financial engineering behind modern exile arrangements is sophisticated. It's not just patronage, it's high finance.
Assad's retirement package is more complex than most people's investment portfolios.
Significantly more complex and significantly less transparent, and probably with a better yield.
All right, let's bring this in for a landing. What are the practical takeaways for our listeners?
I'd highlight three things. First, when you see headlines about regime collapse, look for what happened to the institutional infrastructure, not just the leader. The leader is the least important part of the equation in many ways.
The person is the brand. The institution is the business.
Good way to put it. Second, follow Russian financial flows to Syrian connected entities. The money trail reveals more about the regime's operational status than any political statement. If former regime figures are still accessing funds through Russian banks, the network is still active. It's the vital sign to monitor.
And third?
Third, watch the Moscow exile ecosystem as a leading indicator of Russian geopolitical strategy. The pattern of who Russia chooses to host, how they're managed, and eventually whether they're traded or maintained, tells you a lot about how Russia sees its strategic position in a given region. It's their playbook in public view.
All right. So, to circle back to Daniel's original question, what about the rest of the regime, and why is Russia so friendly with them? The answer is that the rest of the regime didn't disappear. It relocated. And Russia's friendship isn't really friendship at all. It's a strategic investment in maintaining influence over Syria's future, with Assad as the insurance policy.
That's a solid summary. The regime is a network, not a person, and Russia treats it as such.
Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop. Big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show. This has been My Weird Prompts. If you're enjoying the show, a quick review on your podcast app helps us reach new listeners.
Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll catch you next time.
This episode was produced using Xiaomi Mimo V2 Pro. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts.